Hello, I'm David Healy, and I'm giving a talk that I've recently given in the University of Maastricht and to a group of primary care doctors in Stockholm. And it begins with a very controversial title, at least for me, In Praise of SSRIs. So let's jump into the first slide. Sorry now, we're getting all sorts of problems here. Right, here's the first slide. What you're seeing here is a group of early tricyclic antidepressants. The one on the top in the middle, called imipramine, was the first of these. It was brought out in 1958, and a year later, in 1959, a group of senior psychiatrists across Europe were convened in a meeting to report back on their experience with imipramine. They were very clear that it treats melancholia. This is the severest mood disorder there is. And prior to imipramine, people only had electroconvulsive therapy to treat it. It was a condition that came with a high risk of people going on to commit suicide. And all the doctors convened, agreed that imipramine worked for this condition and was going to save lives, and they might be able to replace ECT. But they also mentioned, at least quite a few of them did, that imipramine in its own right has the capacity to cause people to become suicidal. You put them on the drug, they weren't suicidal beforehand, they become suicidal, you stop the drug, the problem clears up, you reintroduce the drug and the problem comes back. Imipramine, which saves lives from suicide, can also cause people to commit suicide. Doctors could see it then, but doctors now treating people who are mildly depressed at no risk of suicide see people becoming suicidal on SSRIs and can't spot this or don't know what to do with it. Why is this? The drug on the right-hand side is amitriptyline, and that was discovered by Frank Aid a year later. And he was pleased because it meant he no longer had to give his father electroconvulsive therapy on their kitchen table. Aid had no wish to deter people from seeking treatment with his drug and didn't, well, you might have thought today he'd be stopped from mentioning that there could be problems, but he noted that although melancholia can usually cause people's libido to be wiped out, they have no interest to make love, they try, they can't. But when he gave them amitriptyline, he could spot that it also caused problems with people's libido and their ability to make love. And he was happy to come out and say, look, this is the thing we have to keep an eye out for now. Doctors today can't spot people who are mildly depressed who have no libido problems to begin with, ending up with severe libido problems and unable to make love when they're on these drugs. Why can't doctors today do that? Okay, the third point is a bit more cheerful. If you look at the three drugs across the top there, by 1961, just 3 years after the first of these drugs comes out, Julius Axelrod had done the work that won him a Nobel Prize. He said, look, all three of these drugs can inhibit norepinephrine reuptake, noradrenaline reuptake. And this led a few years later to what was called the catecholamine hypothesis of depression, which was depression involves lowered monoamines. Let's just put those right, and people will get well. And if we focus just on pure norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, we'll have a very effective drug with no side effects. Turned out that really wasn't the case. But the catecholamine hypothesis was the first of the monoamine hypotheses that later became the idea of low serotonin levels or chemical imbalances that was uh, lampooned in a cartoon that you see here from 30 years ago by an Australian cartoonist who said, look, depression's nothing but a simple lowering of amine levels with drugs to put that right, and you're going to be absolutely normal again in a short period of time. Now, the problem with all this was that the benzodiazepine group of drugs we also had did something very obviously useful almost instantly after you went on them. And you figured, well, yes, that's the useful thing that helps produce improvements later on. The antipsychotic group of drugs were pretty much the same. They do useful things that people could look at and point to. Well, this happens reasonably instantly, and that's what's consistent with what these drugs do that produces much bigger improvements later on. And the stimulant group of drugs is the same. But the antidepressants didn't seem to be doing anything obviously useful early on. And it took 2 or 3 weeks for people to get well. 2 weeks is what people used to say in terms of patients who had melancholia, that's severe mood disorders. And the impression was that these drugs are clearing an illness. So when the drugs were shown to inhibit norepinephrine reuptake levels to increase the amount of norepinephrine we have pretty instantly, but nothing happened, we realized that this can't be right. And people began talking about catecholamine receptors, the beta receptor. And we had this idea that it takes 2 weeks of chiseling away at this lump of protein before the protein goes back to normal and people get well. And since then, we've had views like BDNF, that's brain-derived neurotropic factor, that this is what needs to happen. There needs to be more of this being produced before people get well. This is what melancholia used to look like. It was a rare condition, affected people in middle age. You gave them drugs like antihistamines or the benzodiazepines, they didn't get well. You gave them the antidepressants, there was nothing obvious that happened to these patients for 2 weeks or so, and then all of a sudden they get well. So when we came out with the beta adrenergic hypothesis, that was a man called Friedland-Sulzer. This was what we found soon afterwards as well, was that the beta receptors changed pretty quickly also, so that couldn't be the answer. The problem with all this, these ideas about what antidepressants are doing, they're all based on the idea that they cure the illness, they fix the problem, the lesion, as opposed to just doing something. And this grin has been left behind. It's a bit like the Cheshire cat you see here from Alice in Wonderland that disappeared and left its grin behind. Well, the catecholamine cat has also disappeared but left this grin behind that there's something these drugs must be doing that we now say can take up to 6 weeks to happen. You're routinely told people who are on these drugs it can take 6 weeks before they work. And the idea is they're doing something at 6 weeks that we don't yet know about. Now, I've mentioned a few names like Julius Axelrod and Frank Aid. I'm going to mention Arvid Carlson a lot, and there's Joe Schildkraut who formed the catecholamine hypothesis and Friedland-Sulzer. And I've interviewed all these people and 100 more people who were involved in creating the field, and the interviews are in 3 books, which are out of print now. And if you're trying to buy them on the black market, it might cost you €1,000 to get all 3. But you can get all 3 books and more interviews for free on the samizdathealth.org website. And I'm going to have a blog post about this talk with all the slides and all the text and links to where you can get these interviews. There are some really absolutely fascinating interviews. But if you can't get them, just email me and I'll be able to help you get there. Now, this is back to the original slide you've seen, and an extraordinary point, which was during the 1960s, a bunch of Freudian doctors, whom you might have thought would be hostile to the drugs, commented, we see people, either we've put them on antidepressants like these, or they've come in put on by other doctors, and we can spot that the 3 tricyclic antidepressants on the right-hand side are doing something that desipramine up in the upper left corner isn't doing. And what they said was these drugs change the transference reaction, a very Freudian term. And Arvid Carlson, a Swedish psychopharmacologist, didn't really know what that meant, but was curious because desipramine doesn't inhibit serotonin reuptake, and the 3 on the right, the 3 drugs there on the right, all inhibit serotonin reuptake, in particular clomipramine. So he said, let's make a serotonin reuptake inhibitor that doesn't inhibit norepinephrine reuptake, and let's see what it does. And here's Arvid Carlson, and here's the SSRI, the first SSRI, which was a drug that he made. Prozac was the 6th SSRI, so it was quite late. By the time Prozac came along, people knew what SSRIs do, which is the the change in the transference reaction meant they muted emotional reactivity. They made people serene. They were serenics. They were anxiolytic. Now, the problem with that was that at a time, if you wanted to bring a new anxiolytic drug on the market, you were up against a dinosaur, which was the benzodiazepine group of drugs. It was awfully hard to beat them. So it became clear that the best strategy for Lilly and other pharmaceutical companies was to bring SSRIs in the market as antidepressants. But by the time Prozac came along, it was clear that the SSRIs were not anti-melancholic agents like imipramine was. They treated people who were more mildly depressed. And that meant that the companies had to put these drugs into trials where it was going to be hard to prove they were antidepressants. That's people who are mildly depressed. It was also clear that the marketing would be a case of changing cases of Valium into cases of Prozac, in cases of anxiety into cases of depression. And senior doctors were wheeled out to tell people that, behind most cases of anxiety lies a mood disorder. And if you correct that, if you cure that, if you put the problem right with an antidepressant, you're going to solve the anxiety problem. And it's better to cure something than to give people a crutch. This is all very obvious, and this is an article of mine from 35 years ago saying just this. When Arthur Carlson made an SSRI, he made what he called a therapeutic principle, something that could be useful, not a magic bullet, something that cured a problem. So, like LSD, which acts on a normal serotonin system, SSRIs were drugs that were, from his point of view, going to act on a normal serotonin system also and do something useful. LSD can give you good trips and bad trips. SSRIs would give you good trips and bad trips. And if you asked Arthur Carlson, could a bad trip include people becoming suicidal? He said, absolutely. Yes, it could. What's a therapeutic principle? Well, here's a slide about constipation. And you'll see from this slide that there's 4 different kinds of constipation people can have and 4 different laxative principles. You can add bulk, you can add water, liquid, you can stimulate the gut, or you can relax the gut. And it's important to get the right laxative principle for the constipation you have, or else we risk causing treatment-resistant constipation. And this is true across medicine. We've got 4 or 5 different kinds of antihypertensives, and we need to get the right principle for the kind of hypertension you have. We've got 4 or 5 different kinds of hypoglycemics, and we need to get the right drug for the kind of glucose problems you have. And the same way with nervous problems, we've got 4 or 5 different principles like the benzodiazepines and the stimulants and the antipsychotics and the antidepressants, etc. And it's important to get the right principle for the problem you have, for the nervous problem you have. And if you get the wrong one, let's say, for instance, we put you on an SSRI and it's the wrong principle for you, it leads to what we call today treatment-resistant depression. And we've no idea what's involved here. We do know it's an awful state. It can last for the rest of your life. We don't know how to put it right. And increasingly, young people in a range of different countries are asking for medical assistance in dying because the state is such an uncomfortable state to be in. Now, you might say if we're trying to get a nervous principle, or you might think if we're trying to get a nervous principle, if we're trying to get a therapeutic principle for a nervous disorder, it's going to be something that acts on your brain. But, when we give you a benzodiazepine to treat your nervous disorders, what it does is to relax your muscles, and your brain is fooled into thinking you're not as anxious as it might have thought you were. When we give you a beta blocker for your anxiety, it slows your heart rate and stops the tremble in your voice or in your hand, and your brain is fooled into thinking that this person might not be as anxious as they thought it was. So it's not necessarily the case that these drugs have to work on your brain in order to be helpful. But what I want you to be thinking about is if we're going to be working on either your brain or your body, what's the function that we want to change? And here's a picture of Walter Hess, who won the Nobel Prize in 1949. And Hess wanted to make sure his male students didn't spend their time looking at brain slices or levels of different chemicals. He said, there's no point in that. You need to be thinking the whole time about the function. What's the function you're changing here? Is this something that's going to explain to you why you fall in love with a girl? So these were male research nerds, we'd say today. The girls didn't get into labs back then, but they knew all about function. They knew you could put an anticholinergic drop in your eyes and it causes your pupil to dilate. And that means that a man thinks you're beautiful because what's happening is your pupils being dilated gives him the impression you like him. And if a girl likes him, he's going to fall in love with her. So, this is the point behind function. Right. The very first thing an SSRI does in 1/10 of the antidepressant dose, within 30 minutes to 60 minutes of your first pill, it makes you genitally numb. We've known this from the days of amitriptyline. It can be used as a therapeutic principle. It can be used to manage premature ejaculation problems. It correlates very well with what people talk about as reduced emotional reactivity, which is what the transference reaction is all about. So, we're looking here at what a lot of people said was an obvious thing these drugs do very early on, and is one that, a bit like the benzodiazepine effect, it makes sense that this would help nervous problems. But it's not acting on the brain. It's acting on the sensory nervous system. And most of the serotonin in you and me, as you're going to see, is in our sensory nervous system, not in our brains. Healthy volunteers given these drugs by companies don't complain about genital numbing unless asked about it. And the forms they have to fill up don't include that question normally. And the things that the healthy volunteers mention, the one they mention the most going on an SSRI and coming off an SSRI is dizziness. Now that sounds minor, but it's not when you look at the other terms under which the problem can be reported, like vertigo or falling over or gait disturbances or abnormal coordination, etc., or balance disorder. And what you've got here are reports to FDA by doctors mostly of these problems all happening with SSRIs. So healthy volunteers get it almost instantly, day one. And as they come off it, it can get worse. These are serious problems being reported, not just minor dizziness problems being reported to FDA. And if you take into account that FDA say that only 1 in 100 of these reports get reported to them, then you realize, you multiply the figures you got here by 100, and you realize there's 10 million reports or more here happening. And the PRR word there means proportional reporting ratio. And anything over 1.0 means there's a link to the pill, the SSRI in this case. Anything over 2.0 or 3.0 means there's a very strong link. And here's a further sensory problem. Well, I should have said balance is a sense. We get our balance from proprioceptors that are in our bones, our joints, and our muscles. There's input from the vestibules in our inner ears, and there's input from our eyes also. Now, obviously, visual problems are also a sensory problem. There's less reports of them here, and that's partly because ophthalmologists have never been terribly inclined to report this problem, as you're going to hear a bit later. But again, there's hundreds of thousands of reports and very strong links between the SSRI group of drugs and these problems that you're seeing here. And this all fits with a theory of the emotions that came out in the 1880s, put forward totally independently by two different men, William James and Carl Langer, who said, that our emotions are in our bodies. It's the sensations we have and the feelings that are our emotions. The brain puts labels on these things like anger or joy or this, that, and the other, which these are the emotion words, but often the brain is misinterpreting what's going on. So the key thing is looking at what's happening in the body. And this kind of thinking came about because in the 1830s, we'd first discovered spinal reflexes, where there's a sensory input to the spine and a motor reflex, and there's no need for the brain or the soul or the mind or anything higher like that to be involved. These actions are controlled within the body completely. No mind input at all. And from the 50 years after that to William James and Carl Langer, you had people recognizing that there were reflexes going up and up at the spinal cord. And these were gate controlled, that the input, the sensory input and motor outputs were all managed in a balance. So in some sense, the spinal cord was actually deciding which of these is the more important, is the one that needs to be dealt with first, without the mind being involved. And the best example we have of that today is something that people know about as the gate control theory of pain, that you can show that if you give someone sensory input from another part of their body linked closely to a part that's been injured, which is in awful pain, you can block the pain with other sensory inputs. And what we call your emotional state can play a big part in how much of the pain you feel. You might feel more pain than you need to be feeling, or you might feel no pain at all. If you're involved in a football match and want to make sure your team wins, you might have broken a bone, but you keep on playing. The pain's just not there. And this brings us to the slide on the right there, which shows you the top of the spinal cord. And there's a blue dot, which is where some of your norepinephrine is in what's called a vigilance neuron. And there's a green dot, which is the Rafe nucleus, which is all of your serotonin. Your serotonin that might be linked to the brain. If you think the top of the spinal cord is part of the brain, then the green dot has all of the serotonin in your brain, which is only 5% of the serotonin in you and me. If, like me, you're inclined to view the top of the spinal cord as part of the rest of the body, then 100% of the serotonin in you and me is in our body and none is in our brain. So I'm not trying to say the brain is irrelevant in all this. What I'm trying to get people to appreciate is that we're a bit more like an octopus than we think, that our knowledge is distributed. The octopus looks like it's got a huge brain in this bulbous head, but in fact, there's not much brain in there. Most of the octopus's brain is in its arms and tentacles. And using the brain that's there, it learns an awful lot in its short life, is clearly pretty intelligent and even has a sense of humor. So, it's not clear how much brain we need in all this in the octopus, and maybe less in us than we usually like to think. A lot of our knowledge is embodied rather than in brain. Right. Okay, so this is an image of the effects of LSD. And what LSD classically does is opens the gates to sensation. So there's a lot more sensory imagery coming through the sensory system, too much to gate control in the usual way, and it ends up flooding into the brain, and the brain comes up with all sorts of wild interpretations that we've just met God, we've seen the afterlife, we've witnessed ancestral trauma, which we now figure is actually probably having an effect on us as well. And these are all slightly crazy ideas. That's a strong word, but to agree that this is what's actually happening, you've got to come to a consensus. It can't just be an experience per se. The observables are important, but we need consensus about what is actually being seen. So that's what LSD does. SSRIs do exactly the opposite. They close the sensory gates. They mute the flow of sensations up to the brain. Now you might think, well, if we're doing that to just the right amount, you can see how that would tend to make the brain less anxious. There's less going on that it needs to be vigilant about. And here's the effects of giving one dose of an SSRI to some healthy volunteers. The brain looks like it goes quiet. Now, lots of people with a brain bias looking at that says, oh, look, the SSRIs are working on the brain to damp things down. They don't have to be working on or in the brain at all. I've actually forgot to mention, if you remember the green dot, the Rafe nucleus, which is all the serotonin that's anywhere close to the brain in it, you can wipe that out in animals and they're still able to function pretty normally. But looking at this, the other way to get the picture you're seeing here of the SSRI effect is to shut the sensations from the body coming up to the brain. If there's much less of them, then the brain's going to look like this. And here's a description by a man who got in touch with me to explain about the emotional, the sensory muting that happens on an SSRI. It's a mental anesthesia, he says. Everything is tuned down so low, your thoughts, your emotions, etc., etc. It's the opposite of what the psychedelics do. They enhance. SSRIs mute. One has the impression everything is wiped out. Now, all of these quotes are all going to be on the blog post version of this talk, so you'll be able to see them and download them. Just like the cartoonists knew 30, 40 years ago that the monoamine levels idea, the chemical imbalance levels idea was crazy. They also knew exactly what SSRIs were doing 30 years ago in a way doctors didn't. And here's a Peanuts cartoon from way back. And Lucy, as you'll know if you look at Peanuts, teases Charlie Brown and he always reacts hurt and offended and she loves this. But she's tried to tease him this day, and hey, he's quite mellow and he's no problem at all. And hey, that's good fun. And Lucy knows what's going on, and her reaction is, I hate Prozac. Charlie is now taking Prozac, and she doesn't get the same effects from him as she enjoys getting. Now, we ran a study in this unit here over 25, 26, 27 years ago, where we gave an SSRI and a norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor to some medical and nursing staff. They were blind to what they were on, and they were on each of them for 2 weeks, and then after 2 weeks off, they were crossed over to the one they hadn't been on before. And the idea was they were asked, could they work out which of the two drugs were on and what effects did it have? And this showed quite clearly that Arvid Carlson was right. SSRIs do something different to norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, and it's a mellowing effect. The interesting thing was one of the patients came up to me after 24 to 48 hours and asked me, is that doctor on a drug? Now, the patients in the unit didn't know this was happening. And I said, yes, he is. And the patient said, is it an SSRI? And I didn't know that because we hadn't broken the blind. But when we did, it was an SSRI. And the patient said he knew it was because the doctor was more mellow than usual. Now, the point I want you to pick out of this is this was happening within a day or two. It was clear. If you wanted to know whether this drug was going to suit this person, and the doctor afterwards said, yes, this would help me if I had a nervous problem, then you can see it within a day or so of going on the drug. Your family and friends, people used to looking at you and spotting a difference can see it. Doctors and nurses, supposedly the experts on the patients that they're treating, can't see it because the grin of the catecholamine cat is in the way. They think anything that's happening in the drug early on is just a side effect. It can't be the core action that these drugs have. That anything happens early on is just an adverse effect, and you need to wait 6 weeks for the drug to work. Now, things do go wrong with SSRIs, and one of the reasons here is in this graph here, which is by the time Prozac was trying to get on the market, it was clear that this drug was going to have to be put into trials with people who were mildly depressed. It did not work for severe mood disorders. And that meant it was going to be difficult to beat placebo. And that meant Lilly gave the drug in a toxic dose to people in the trials. This is what's called a dose response curve. And if you look at this, across the bottom at the 5 milligram mark, you'll see that there should be a good response from Prozac. By the time you get up to 10 milligrams or 20 milligrams, which is the dose Lilly used in their trials, you're at a toxic dose. It's 5 milligrams or less would be the optimal dose. And interestingly, after Prozac was licensed, Lilly published a trial with Joe Wernicke, one of their employees, as the lead author, and it says 5 milligrams of Prozac is just as good as any other doses. And Joe, off the record, said to his colleagues, what are we going to tell people about this trial? Now, to make the 20 milligram dose vaguely tolerable as opposed to just toxic, Lilly gave a lot of people in their trials benzodiazepines. If I was running a cancer chemotherapy trial and gave benzodiazepines with the chemotherapy, that wouldn't be too bad because we don't think benzodiazepines are going to cure cancer. In fact, if anything, they increase the risks. It is a problem if we're giving benzodiazepines in a trial of a new anxiolytic that's going to be brought on the market to replace those hazardous benzodiazepines. And the only way to get it on the market is to damp down the hazards of the new anxiolytic with benzodiazepines. That's perverse. When we take LSD and have a bad trip, we don't break the serotonin system. You have to be taking huge amounts of it all the time to do that. In the case of SSRIs, we're giving them in toxic doses, and you're on these drugs for months or years, and it's clear that for some people, parts of your sensory system are going to break. And one of the consequences of that is in the sexual sphere, where people get post-SSRI sexual dysfunction, PSSD. And here's Bryn and Roy telling you about this, which is one of the problems is you go along to a doctor and try and explain this, and they simply don't believe you. You know, you could be going along with your arm removed and saying to the doctor, look, I've lost my arm. And it's like the doctor says to you, well, you look normal to me. I can't see a difference. Uh, and what Bryn is also saying is it's, you know, when you lose a sense, it has a profound effect on me, the person, on my subjectivity. And Roy is saying very much the same thing. And Bryn is saying, you know, people aren't going to believe us because everybody will say FDA and EMA and other regulators wouldn't let a drug on the market that could cause something like this. Something similar happens to the commonest problems volunteers report, which is dizziness. And there's a new condition that got described and got diagnostic criteria 10 years ago called PPPD, persistent postural perceptual dizziness. And this is not just dizziness, it's more like vertigo. Think if you got dizziness on a tightrope. That's what it's like. You're on an SSRI, you know, soon after you go on it, you may find you can't walk up a simple set of steps easily without concentrating a lot harder than usual. And things may be okay when you go on the drug first. When you come off it, you may have a problem. And when you come off it, like with PPPD, which is sexual problems that can start on the drug or sexual problems that can get worse when you come off the drug, these things can last for the rest of your life. And we don't know how to put them right. And losing your balance, when you're on a tightrope, if you become emotional, you're going to lose your balance and fall off because when you become emotional, your mind is imagining the actions, the anger, the shouting, the gesticulating, and that sends blood to your muscles, which alters your weight on one side of your body, and you topple off the tightrope. So balance is closely linked to emotional balance. And this image here on the left, I think, marvelously gets hold of all that. It gives you a sense of how when your senses are impaired, you are impaired. And there's a problem in the visual system. I've told you ophthalmologists don't report these problems, and I'll explain why now in a minute. But these things can start when you go on an SSRI, and we've just had a paper out, which is the biggest paper linking visual snow syndrome to one group of drugs, the SSRIs, that's in the published literature. So when they came out, we found this kind of thing was happening on an SSRI soon after you go on it, or might only start after you come off it, or might begin while you're on it and continue after you come off it. And there are some people for whom it keeps going for months or years. And people who have problems with their eyesight like this can often talk about they feel like they're going mad. And if they go along to an ophthalmologist who looks in their ears and says he can see nothing, looks in their eyes and says he can see nothing wrong with their eyes, that they must have a brain problem, by which he or she will mean a mental problem. And typically they're talking about functional neurological disorder, which is a modern term for hysteria. We think you've been abused during childhood and you need psychotherapy to discover what the abuse was, etc. And of course, it's easier to think this way about a patient if they've been on an SSRI, and they'll all be told to go back on your SSRI and for sure continue with your SSRI because you're clearly anxious and this is the thing to do. So this is partly why ophthalmologists don't report it. They don't think it's linked to eyes, even though, comparatively speaking, given the size of the eye and the size of your brain, there's more serotonin in your eye than in your brain. So, you know, we're actually missing things here. Now, when I try to explain to people that who've got balance problems or visual problems or PSSD, and they say, my brain's broken, and I say, look, there's nothing wrong with your brain. Usually they're able to talk to me awfully coherently. They're able to write long things about what's wrong with them and things like that. And all the brain tests we ever do come back normal. People don't believe me. But this is almost the best proof of the point I'm trying to make, which is your knowledge is broken, but it's your embodied knowledge that's broken. Nothing in your brain. It's what's in your body is broken. And part of the reason why I say that is if we've got a muscle memory problem linked to playing the piano or whatever it is, or your golf swing, and we try to fix it by attending and concentrating, we can't do it. The usual way to fix our problems by paying more heed and concentrating doesn't work. And it's effortful and frustrating, which is why people complain about brain fog when their brains are working absolutely normally. This cartoon helps bring it out. It's a bit like learning to walk or ride a bike. Googling it, telling you how to do it, isn't going to get you riding a bike or up on your feet. Embodied knowledge is something we learn by just blunt repetition, by falling over and adjusting the balance on the bike bit by bit. We can feel it getting slightly better and then we get confident. And we can only put it right in the same way by blunt repetition. It's not by concentrating. Now, it may surprise you with me talking about all these SSRI problems to know that when Zoloft was launched in the UK around 1992, I chaired one of the meetings for Pfizer on this. And here's the talk that I gave. And it said to the audience there that, look, serotonin is more primitive than estrogen are androgens. And if we've got drugs that act on it, we're going to see things that we've never seen before. And we need to keep an eye out on these because we're going to learn things. We're going to be able to move the science forward. And maybe even if they're bad things, it'll help us discover new drugs. Julius Axelrod, who found norepinephrine reuptake and serotonin reuptake, paid no heed to the serotonin reuptake because he said serotonin is a relic of our marine past. It is very primitive, but not as primitive as carbonic anhydrase, and SSRIs and some other drugs we use in mental health activate carbonic anhydrase, and this produces an effect I'm going to explain to you now in a minute. All these drugs do things like this. They don't just act on one thing, partly because they're small molecules, which means they get everywhere and do 100 different things. And here's Bruce Springsteen talking about a problem called akathisia, or agitation, which you can get on an SSRI. And Bruce, I think, is making the point very well that, you know, it's an uncomfortable sensation in my skin. It's a sensory problem, not a motor. You may be restless and walk around, but it's not a motor problem. It's a sensory problem. And he says further down that it's this endless, irritating, existential angst embedded in my bones. And there's a thin layer of coating to our bones. And if you get fluid in between the coating to the bone and the bone, it'll do just what Bruce seemed to think it was doing to him. And he says, I couldn't live like this. I understood what drives people to commit suicide. It was demanding answers that I did not have. When you've got sensations coming up from your body, either you need to go to the loo or whatever, you know, your brain pays heed, and if it can recognize what needs to happen, you make sure it happens. If you don't know what's going on because you've never had this feeling before, the brain is kind of perplexed. Now, If this happens when you're on a drug like an SSRI, which causes sensory muting also, rather than the problem being less than it would be, it can potentially become more than it might have been. And here's a man taking an SSRI who describes the visual problems he had. It transformed his vision into a two-dimensional video game, and it did the same to his thinking. There was a loss of depth to his thinking. He was reacting to things on the surface. He couldn't see through to the consequences of what he might do. If he had an impulse to drive his car at night or whatever, he'd just go. He didn't think about the time. He didn't think about should he be in bed. He didn't think about work the next day. He didn't even think to bring his phone out, and he was in a job that involved being on call. He sometimes went out without his shoes. And this was when he had an impulse to walk, for instance. He'd head out without his shoes on. He had the impulse, he did it. And here's a lady, I'm not going to tell you what happened here, but something pretty grim and awful happened. Uh, and she's been interviewed by a policeman shortly afterwards who knows what's happened and is trying to work out why on earth she did what she did. And she's saying, I was thinking I wanted to stop, but I didn't want to do it, but I had to. Why did you have to do it? Because I'd started it. I can't explain it. And this is very like what a person, you or I, might say if we were under hypnosis and the hypnotist had told us to do something, uh, and we couldn't explain later why we did it. You know, I started it, I was under instructions, as it were. I started it and did it, but I don't know why. I knew this was a bit crazy, but I did it. Uh, what if you've got reduced sensory input, and but then some sensory input you have to explain? That becomes the dominant thing in your brain. It's the thing you essentially have to follow. So this is why the combination of carbonic anhydrase actions and SSRI actions can be so malignant. Now, I'd explained to you that SSRIs work in the sensory system pretty immediately and do something that's potentially clinically useful, which we should be able to spot instantly when you go on the drugs, and make sure that you're the kind of person that's going to find this useful and you're going to find it useful in the right dose. This is not what happened to Woody Witzak, and what happened to Woody is all too common these days. This is Woody and Kim Witzak you see here. They're both happily married. They're both in good jobs. He's just moved to a job that's even better, one that he's been keen to get for a while. Um, they've got loads of trips planned. They're about to start a family. And Woody's just changed jobs and has a few nights poor sleep, and ends up going to his doctor, who's a good doctor, who says, "Oh, I'll give you some Zoloft," and he does. Now, Kim is away a bit over the next few weeks because she's got trips for work, so she doesn't quite see what's happening to Woody, who becomes anxious. He's got periods have been fine and normal when he's on the phone to her, and she doesn't think there's anything wrong. But in between, there are periods where he's anxious. And when she gets home, she spots this, that he's having bad periods, where he's lying on the floor, holding his head, saying, "You wouldn't believe the thoughts going through my head." And they agree he should go back to the doctor, which he does, and then she's off on a trip again. The doctor tells him this is normal for an SSRI. You need to hang on in there for 6 weeks or so before we know whether these drugs are going to work for you or not. Now, that's partly the grin of the catecholamine cat coming back, but there's another factor going on. Woody hung himself after 5 weeks. This is the Great Seal of the United States, which says, E pluribus unum, out of many, one people. But I've changed, or a colleague has changed the word unum to mediocris for me. Mediocris is the Latin for average. Mediocre is probably also a good translation. And when companies knew their SSRIs were going to be difficult to get licensed as antidepressants, they knew they had to do far more than just the 2 trials of their drug in order to get the 2 trials needed to get FDA approval. And even with that, it was going to be hard to get a approval. But they knew that that was all they had to get. And if they did tricks like adding benzodiazepines in and coding certain events in particular ways and using statistical tricks between one thing and the other and making some people vanish, they'd be able to get 2 trials that FDA could look at and say, well, yes, we can license you because you've got 2 trials that appear to be just about positive compared to placebo. Now, The wrong interpretation of this is that SSRI effects are just placebo effects. If you put LSD into trials of the same group of patients and average out the LSD effects between the good trips and the bad trips, you'd get an average effect that might only just about be placebo. But no one thinks LSD is only a placebo. It's having real effects, good and bad. So when the companies got their drugs licensed with two trials that were just about beating placebo, in which there were some people having clearly good trips. How many people had good trips? Well, the answer is, according to FDA, had 100,000 people go through these drugs. Their view is that only 1 in 6 of us have good trips on these drugs at this high dose. Uh, that um, um, that when we go along to a doctor, we're expecting to get a good trip. When the doctor gives us a drug, he or she is expecting to give us a good trip, but it's only 1 in 6 of us are going to get a trip like that. FDA knew this 35 years ago, and that's part of the reason why they were willing to license the drugs. And their view was really, well, these drugs do work for some people, and we let doctors work out how to use them afterwards. One of the key points is there was no evidence from the 100,000 patients of anyone having a bad trip on an SSRI that all of a sudden at 6 weeks turned into a good trip. There's nothing biological happening at 6 weeks to say you should hang on till these drugs start working. It was purely a bureaucratic time frame that has brought this idea that we need to keep you on these drugs for 6 weeks into the frame. But when the companies got FDA approval for their SSRIs as antidepressants, they were able to create a wonderland. And this is true of all the drugs we use. It's like Alice going down into Wonderland and seeing a bit of food with an eat me label on it and a drink with a drink me label on it and being powerless not to do what she's told. In the same kind of way, unlike soft cheeses and processed meats, which pregnant women don't take these days, antidepressants come labeled with an FDA label saying it works. And as a result, an increasing number of people, particularly the more highly educated you are, and if you've gone to Harvard in particular, you're most likely to be taking these drugs during pregnancy, and their use is increasing the whole time. Now, what the Freudians who discovered the SSRIs will be able to say to you is, we understand what's going on here. We've got a situation of delegated narcissism here. Let me explain. Oh, I've got to hop one slide before I actually tell you more about what's going on. I was going to open the talk with this slide, which is Mark Antony burying Caesar, who's saying to the Romans, friends, Romans and countrymen, I'm here to bury Caesar, not to praise him. I was going to open the talk by saying I'm here to praise the SSRIs, not bury them. And despite what you've heard, this is what you're going to hear about in the next few slides. But there is a burial, and it's going to be medicine as we know it, and potentially doctors. So this is why I'm giving the talk, trying to wake people up slightly. Here you see an image of a plane door that's blown off, and the Federal Aviation Authority, just like FDA, license planes the way FDA licensed drugs. That is by looking at paperwork. They don't fly planes. They don't check the doors before the plane takes off to see if it's okay. They trust the pilot to keep you safe in the air. And she has an incentive to keep you safe because if she doesn't get to New York, well, if you don't get to New York, she doesn't get there either. Doctors are supposed to be the pilots on healthcare planes, but these days the incentives for them, if the plane door blows off, and you complain about it, is to throw you out through the door for spreading treatment hesitancy. There's no incentive for the doctor to take your side, and that's because of the delegated narcissism problem. When we're young, we delegate our narcissism to our parents. They're the ones who are wise and know best. When the times are uncertain in the world, we delegate narcissism to dictators and gurus. But professionals like doctors or lawyers are not supposed to be delegating narcissism to bureaucrats who look over paperwork. So when something like that happens, something has gone badly wrong. And what's happening? The pressure in the system. And first of all, the companies have nudged us all, the public and doctors, to regard FDA as the experts. And they're not. They're just bureaucrats. But companies are in the business not of making drugs that are going to save lives, which will be easy for professionals to recommend. In terms of most of the drugs that go through the FDA system, 90% of them in the clinical trials, more lives are lost on the new active treatment than on the placebo. Partly because companies don't make money from drugs that save lives. As Goldman Sachs have said, if a drug saves lives, there's pressure to push the price down. Where companies make their money is from cosmetic or vanity drugs, drugs for hair loss, for erectile dysfunction, SSRIs, acne, or whatever. And they say, wait. So there's that problem for doctors. And then there's the other thing, which is when someone walks in and has a very clear and evident problem on the drug that you've put them on, but it's not in the label of the drug and it's not in the guidelines and it's nowhere, no articles in any of the medical journals say that this drug can cause that. Doctors, unless they're professionals, are going to take the side of the regulators and the guideline bodies rather than the patient who's got no background in healthcare. They're not going to be practicing evidence-based medicine. So where does that take us? Well, let me take you back a bit. I had a book that came out 30 years ago called The Antidepressant Era, which gave a history of the antidepressants, and ran a thought experiment in it, which said, look, if these drugs were available over the counter, I wouldn't have to make you diseased to give you Prozac. I'm going to disable you by saying you're diseased. Am I going to be bringing good out of doing this? The problem I'm causing you by disabling you, are we going to be able to overcome this by really making a real difference with this pill? Now, I wasn't advocating this as a policy matter. I was saying it's a thought experiment. You need to think about what's going on here. If these drugs were available over the counter, companies wouldn't have had to make you diseased. Now, as a policy issue, Woody Woodsack's case does suggest we might need to be thinking a bit more clearly about what we're doing, which is if Woody was taking the drug on the left there, which is a potent serotonin reuptake inhibitor, rather than the Zoloft he was put on, he'd be alive today. Why? Well, this is available over the counter, and as an over-the-counter drug, Woody was in control of what's going on, and if he didn't like the reaction, he's going to stop it. He's not going to be inhibited by a doctor telling him to hang on in there for 6 weeks. 30 years ago, I had the sense to say, look, things wouldn't be a lot better if these drugs were available over the counter because companies would find a way to switch from making sure that no doctor has a thought in their mind not put there by them, which is the current situation, to making sure that no member of the public has a thought in their mind not put there by them. And in recent years, we've got a profusion of online platforms like Hims and Hers, whom you see here on the right, marketing drugs for erectile dysfunction, for acne, for weight loss, for hair loss, for SSRIs, for being nervous, etc., to Gen Z mostly. And they're using a trick which I mentioned 30 years ago would be used and is used with doctors, which is companies have learned that generating figures by giving us rating scales or putting us up on weighing scales or using peak flow meters or blood this levels or blood that levels are a powerful way to sell medicines. The image here is of weighing ourselves for the first time in 1860s France. 10 years after we began to weigh ourselves for the first time, a new mental illness was born, anorexia nervosa. And it changed our view of ourselves from using fasting for holiness purposes to fasting for health and beauty purposes. Now, here's a slide that you're not going to have seen before. And this is what we usually see in this area is the prevalence of SSRI use, and women use more than men. And what I forgot to say in the previous slide, I should have mentioned, is that Hims and Hers and other online platforms are using rating scales. They've created food noise scales to enhance to give validity to your use of weight loss drugs, for instance. They're doing exactly the same tricks, and smartphones generally are a place where apps which measure everything from your pulse rate to the number of steps you take each day to your sleep quality, etc., are measuring these things the whole time. And companies know that their drugs can be the perfect answer to any variation in your figures that you want restored to the optimal. So here's the figure, as I mentioned, on use of antidepressants, but not the usual prevalence figures, you see, which would be 4 times higher than this, particularly for the green line in the middle. The green line in the middle is women in the age of 45 to 54, and these are representative of all older women. And the rates at which women like this is up to 20 to 25% of the population have been using SSRIs has remained relatively constant from 5 years into the point where these drugs were brought on the market first, for about 30 years. But you see there's a big change in the red line and the blue line. The red line is 18 to 24-year-olds, and the blue line is 10 to 17-year-olds. And even before COVID, these were rising quite rapidly. And this is new starts. Incidence means people starting on SSRIs. And the people who are most likely to start on these drugs now are in the younger age group. Now, the older age groups, the prevalence rates are much higher, partly because people end up staying on them. They can't get off them. But as it turns out, younger people find it harder to get off them than older people do. And the prevalence rates in the 10 to 24 age bracket in the last 10 years or so has gone up, just in that bracket, has gone up 110%. And these figures here are just for prescribed SSRIs. They don't include the Hims and Hers online platforms where Gen Z and other younger people can get these drugs from without having to go to a doctor. And again, in the same time period, here's the increasing suicide rates in males and females in this age bracket. And you see that they're escalating. The male rates are a good bit higher than the female rates, but this is just showing the escalation in rates, which is the same for both males and females. It's hugely increasing over the last 10 years. And again, starting before COVID, it all coincides to some extent with the increased use in smartphones. And here, the last graph and the third last slide is the most solid finding in all of the social sciences, which is the dark blue line. There's 600 studies showing this, which is that the unhappiest period of life is between the age of 42 or 3 and 63 or 4. When you get to be as old as I am, your happiness improves hugely. And when you're in your teenage years and 20s, you're reasonably happy compared with later in life. And these figures coincide with the rates of disability payments. Now, in the last 10 years or so, there's been a big change, and the most unhappy period of life is from the age of 10 through to about the age of 50. And this again coincides with disability payments. The disability payments for the blue line were largely musculoskeletal. The disability payments for the red dotted line increasingly are mental health payments, leading to perceptions that we're creating a generation sick note, and this might cause serious problems for welfare states generally. So, is there a way to put any of this right? Well, this is the Royal Society in 1660. It's a bunch of men. They've convened to look at an event. The event might be transfusing blood from a young dog into an old dog. So you had some observables, and the idea was for the guys there to come to a consensus about what they were seeing. Or they might be looking down a new instrument, which they called a microscope, at what appeared to be tiny animals they called microbes. And again, the idea was to get consensus about the observables. And a case report got written about this event. There were no, no, no statistics here. There was no repetition here. But there was a case report written up, and there were no companies or regulators around to say these are anecdotes. But this is the process that put men on the moon, that decoded the human genome, and was increasing life expectancies through to the 1960s. In terms of medicine, medical journals just appeared 200 years later. Randomized controlled trials and the statistics that go with them appeared 300 years later, and played no part in the 1950s, which was the decade when most of the drug classes we have now were discovered. And whereas many of the drugs that were actually discovered then are still best in class, like imipramine, in terms of treating melancholy in a way that SSRIs just don't. And these were all discovered without a single randomized controlled trial or any statistics. The purest form of science we can do now today that maps beautifully onto what you're seeing here is when a doctor gives a patient a pill. You're starting an experiment. Science is not about following something. That's a religion. It's about a process, and we repeat the process when I give someone a pill, which even if we know what this pill does on average, it's still a new experiment giving this pill to this person. Medicine used to be about people bringing their problems to us. It's become, since the 1980s, us running clinics where we screen people and give them problems they didn't know they had, but not based on the science, which really should start with them bringing their problems to us, which is, it happens most commonly now when a person has an adverse event on a drug and they bring their problems to us and we throw them out the door. When we're talking about a problem on a pill, the patient is in a unique position. They are the one who can tell us about observables, which the rest of us can't see. Their family and friends are also in a position to observe things, as the patients in the Hergest unit where I was working were, compared to the doctors and nurses who were blind to what was right in front of their eyes. So we need a bunch of people in the room. We need to get a consensus between us all as to what we think is happening, as to the observables, rather than the explanation necessarily. The explanation comes later. It's consensus on the observables. First of all, that's the key thing. That's the scientific process, but that's not what's happening in medicine today. How do we get back to that? Well, this doctor here, like in The Wizard of Oz, needs a new heart and a new brain and courage, perhaps given to him by an ordinary girl who's dilated her eyes to make him think that she thinks he's amazing, and that might give him the courage to try and do something. First thing, of course, would be take off the uniform and react as a normal human being would. The second thing is he's got to be a professional, which does not mean keeping to the guidelines, anything but. A professional, a medical professional or a legal professional is someone who takes your side when you bring a problem to them and tries to help you work out how to move forward. He is not, or she is not, a representative of church and state who write the guidelines and in order to get you to conform to what they want you to be like. There's a few very simple wins here in terms of improving on the 1 in 6 rate of good trips on SSRIs. We should only be giving SSRIs in a 2 to 5 milligram dose. We get a lot more good trips if we did that. We should be telling people what we're aiming at. You cannot say, I just want you to get well. We don't do that for diabetes. We don't say, I just want your diabetes cured. We want to specify what it is we're giving you this drug for in order to help the situation that you're in now, which may change later on. There's a number of different principles. So You want to be able to tell someone if you're giving them an SSRI that I want this drug to act on your sensory nervous system to mute your senses. And it's only if you have the right amount of muting and can say to me that you find this helpful for you, that this is going to be the right drug for you. And if we ensure that these are the rules under which we're operating, and you know that you're in a position to offer me responses to what I've just said that I'm going to pay heed to, you're not going to be a Woody Woodsack. You're not going to end up dead in the way you will if I don't specify what I want the drug to do and just say, well, it just works. You need to keep taking it for 6 weeks. I have no idea why, but okay. So that's moving things forward therapeutically. From a science point of view, just to reassure doctors, in the mental health field at least, the iconic figure isn't really Freud, it's a man called Emil Kraepelin, who wrote the textbook of psychiatry in 1896, which established the mental health field as we understand it today. Before that, in 1880, working with a man called Willem Wundt, Kraepelin created what he called pharmacopsychology, which is not psychopharmacology. Psychopharmacology is where do drugs go and what levels of this, that, and the other do they alter. Pharmacopsychology was taking caffeine and alcohol and cocaine and opioids, which they had then, and giving these to healthy volunteers in order to try and analyze what we're made of. How do human beings work? What aspects of our personality all come into play? Kraepelin and Wundt would have died for an SSRI, which is acting on our subjectivity, both it and LSD, in ways that very few other drugs do. And this is the last big frontier that we need to work at in order to understand ourselves more. There's all sorts of issues to do with the boundaries between voluntary and involuntary behavior that these drugs can help us explore. There's issues about even how many senses we have. You'd imagine several thousand years later, we know how many senses we have. Well, in actual fact, 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago, we discovered a whole new sense in the skin, which is the biggest organ in the body. We can see into the brain and see what it's doing in ways we could never do before. The skin, which is right in front of all of us, we don't have a clue what's going on in it. Just over 10 years ago, we discovered piezo proteins, piezo 1 and piezo 2. There's a bunch of people with a piezo 2 gene variation, which means they've got numb genitals, which means they've got poor balance, which means they've got poor vision. All of the things the SSRIs break. We've been looking in the wrong place for where the problems may lie. But it's not just that. I mentioned balance and vision and erotic sensibility. What about smell? Well, you can play a trick if you're feeling awfully mischievous. You can take a bunch of people at a social event, couples, and if you have their attention, you can ask, how many women here think a man's smell is important? And if you're watching, you'll see half of the women's eyes will light up and the other half of the women might be a little discombobulated. Now, I think from my experience of all this, I think women are the ones who choose men. But think about this, if that's the case. I've got a bunch of men I've put on pills. And they tell me, yeah, yes, this pill's working fine for me, but my wife tells me my smell has changed. What's that going to do to the relationship? What's it going to do to the relationship if she gets parosmia, which SSRIs are one of the most common causes of, so that everything smells worse than it was before, smells terrible? What I'm dealing with here is we have a chance with the SSRI group of drugs to explore what could be called material me, or better again, to explore what we maybe should be calling material us.